There's something I've been thinking about lately. What are we actually seeing? Not what are we looking at, but what are we actually seeing? Because those aren't necessarily the same thing. You can look directly at something and already have an entire interpretation of it before you really noticed what is there. Let's take the same scenario from my previous video. You can look in the mirror and see gray hair. But are you seeing gray hair or are you seeing aging? Are you seeing aging or are you seeing what you've learned about what aging means? Maybe it's loss or not pretty or youthful enough. Maybe it's aging gracefully or freedom. Maybe it's something that needs to be fixed ASAP. Suddenly, something very simple like hair that is changing color naturally is carrying an entire world of meaning. So, where did that world come from? Because somewhere between what is in front of us, something is participating in how we see images, memory, standards, beliefs, conditioning, where attention has learned to go. In this reflection, I want to explore that movement through some of the ideas of Jean Baudrillard, particularly his work around images, simulation, and hyperreality, and bring those ideas into relationship with something I talk about often attention. Because maybe you found yourself questioning some of this too. Maybe you've started looking at the world around you and even at yourself and wondering how much of what I see as reality have I actually learned to see this way? How much of what I value was already given significance before I ever consciously chose it? How much of what I call me has been shaped by images, expectations, standards, experiences, and ideas I've encountered over the course of my life? And maybe once you begin noticing some of this, another difficulty appears. You can't necessarily unsee it. You may even begin wondering whether you've become too aware. Because once you recognize how much of what we experience has already been interpreted, presented, conditioned, and given meaning, it can become difficult to know what to trust. So maybe the question isn't only, what am I seeing? Maybe it's, what has taught me to see it in this way? And maybe even more importantly, how do I meet my life once I begin recognizing the difference? And that's the question I want to sit with here. Let's begin. Jean Baudrillard was a French philosopher, sociologist, and cultural theorist best known for examining how signs, images, media, consumption, and representation can begin to shape and even replace our experience of reality. And I think it's helpful to place him in a time for a moment. Baudrillard was born in 1929 and lived until 2007. Much of the work we're drawing from here developed during the second half of the 20th century, particularly from the 1960s onward. So he was observing a world undergoing enormous cultural and technological change. Post war consumer society was expanding, advertising was becoming increasingly sophisticated, television and mass media were changing how people encountered events, people, products, and places beyond their immediate experience. Brands weren't simply selling objects. Increasingly, products could communicate status, identity, lifestyle, and belonging. And images were becoming an increasingly powerful part of how reality itself was encountered and understood. That's important because Baudrillard wasn't writing about Instagram. He wasn't writing about influencers. He wasn't looking at AI, generated people, algorithmic feeds, or the ability to carry an endless stream of images around in your pocket. He was observing something that was already developing before any of those things existed. And he began asking what happens when we don't simply consume objects anymore, but also consume the meanings, signs, and identities attached to them. His earlier work focused heavily on consumer society and the way objects acquire meaning beyond their practical use. A product isn't only something you use, it can say something about status, taste, success, belonging, who you are, or perhaps who you want other people to believe you are. Over time, his work moved further into questions of media, science, simulation, and what happens when representations no longer simply reflect the world, but begin participating in how the world is experienced. And that's what makes his work feel surprisingly contemporary. The technology has changed enormously. The volume and speed of representation have changed enormously. But some of the questions he was asking have become even harder to ignore. What happens when the image stops simply representing reality and begins teaching us what reality is supposed to look like? Because ordinarily, we assume something exists first and then we create an image of it. There's a person, then there's a photograph of the person, there's an experience, then there's a story about the experience, there's a place, then there's an image of the place. Reality first, representation second. But what happens when that relationship reverses? What happens when we have seen so many representations of something that when we finally encounter the thing itself, we're comparing the actual experience with the representation? Think about traveling somewhere you've seen hundreds of times online. Before you've ever arrived, you know what you're supposed to see. You know the photograph, you know the viewpoint, you know what the sunset is supposed to look like. You may even know where you're supposed to stand. So you arrive at this space you've never physically visited before, but in some sense, you've already encountered it. And attention begins looking for what it recognizes. Where is that view? Where is that building? Where is the photograph I've already seen? And now you're not simply encountering the place. You're encountering the place through an image of the place that was already there. The image has begun orienting attention. And that's the part that interests me because this isn't only about photographs, it's about beauty, success, love, spirituality, health, motherhood, masculinity, femininity, happiness, healing, even authenticity. We are surrounded by representations of what these things are supposed to look like. And eventually we can begin arranging our actual lives according to those representations. Think about taking a photograph of yourself. At first, the relationship seems straightforward. Here I am, here is a photograph of me. But then maybe you take another, and then another. You choose the angle you prefer. Maybe you adjust the lighting. Maybe you edit it. Maybe you apply a filter. And then you repeatedly encounter that version of yourself. At some point, something very interesting begins to happen. Instead of the image being compared with the body begins being compared with the image. The direction reverses. The representation becomes the reference point. And Baudrillard gives us language for taking that even further. Because what happens when the image you're comparing yourself with doesn't represent any actual person at all? We can now generate an image of the perfect wellness morning. Beautiful sunlight, perfect skin, linen clothing, plants, trees, a yoga mat, a beautiful room, everything serene, except the person doesn't exist. The room doesn't exist. Nobody drank the tea. Nobody practiced on the mat. There was no morning. And yet we immediately know what the image means. We recognize wellness. Why? Because we recognize the signs. And then an image of a morning that never happened can become the standard against which someone judges the morning they are actually living. Think about that. Something that never happened can make an actual human feel insufficient. Now something else happens. And this isn't limited to synthetic images. Think again about the selfie. After the filters, lighting, angles, editing, and everything else that participates in producing the final image. What exactly am I comparing myself to? And maybe, more importantly, what have I learned to recognize in that image that tells me that this is what beauty, or fill in the blank, looks like? This is what health looks like. This is what success looks like. This is what happiness looks like. The image doesn't simply become a standard. The standard orients attention. If I've learned that youthful skin signifies beauty, the next time I look in the mirror, attention knows where to go. Wrinkle, gray hair, texture, spot. Something becomes foregrounded. And then we tend to say, I noticed. But with conscious practice, the question becomes revealing. Why did I notice that? Not in the sense that noticing it was wrong, but because I can begin asking, what had already made that particular feature significant enough to capture my attention? This is where the representation has begun doing something more than representing. It has participated in training perception. The external image has entered memory, association, expectation, and conditioning, actively participating in the instrument through which the next encounter occurs. And this is where Baudrillard's language of simulation and simulacra becomes useful. Simulation isn't simply pretending. If I'm pretending, there's still an assumed distinction between what is happening and what I'm presenting. I can pretend to be something I'm not, and we can theoretically compare the performance with what is actually here. Simulation complicates that distinction because now the signs and representations aren't simply describing or disguising reality, they begin participating in its production. Think about beauty again. An image establishes what beauty is supposed to look like. People encounter the image. Attention learns what features matter. People begin modifying themselves according to those standards. They create new images, the images circulate, other people encounter them, and the standard becomes further established. So, where exactly does the original end and the representation begin? The image isn't merely reflecting reality anymore. It's helping produce the reality it supposedly represents. And then Baudrillard gives us another word, simulacrum. Simulacrum isn't simply a fake copy. It's a representation whose relationship with an original has become so unstable that the original may no longer be necessary for the representation to function. Let's go back to our wellness image. There was no morning, there was no person, there was no experience. But the signs still work. We recognize wellness because we've learned the visual language of wellness. And the representation can still orient attention, establish a standard, influence behavior, and shape how someone evaluates an actual experience. There doesn't have to be an original morning behind it. The representation is already doing something in the world. And when representations like these become so embedded in experience that the distinction between the real and its simulation becomes increasingly difficult to locate, we arrive at another of Baudrillard's ideas, hyperreality. And this is where hyperreality becomes especially interesting to me. Hyperreality describes a condition in which representations can become more compelling, meaningful, or authoritative than direct experience itself. Disneyland was one of Baudrillard's famous examples, but contemporary life gives us increasingly ordinary ones. This isn't simply about whether something is fake. It's about what happens when reality and its representations become so intertwined that the distinction between them becomes increasingly difficult to locate. And I think attention is enormously important here because an image doesn't have to force you to believe anything. It can teach you where to look, and where attention repeatedly gathers, significance begins to form. Consider the difference between experiencing your life and experiencing yourself, experiencing your life. You eat the meal, then you photograph the meal, choose the photograph, you edit it, post it, observe how others respond, and maybe, almost invisibly, the representation begins influencing the experience itself. The question shifts from what am I experiencing toward what does this experience mean when it's seen? This is something I talk about often in my reflections. Attention doesn't simply observe experience. Where attention gathers and settles matters. When you repeatedly attend to matters. What you repeatedly make significant matters. Because repetition shapes relationship, and relationship shapes how you participate. I imagine Baudrillard might challenge my phrase, return to what is true. And I think it's important here to unpack what I mean by true here. He would ask something closer to what if the systems of science through which we understand reality have become so pervasive that there is no simple return to an untouched real underneath them? You can already sense the tension that creates with my phrase, return to what is true. His work leaves me with a question. How do you know what is true when even your categories for recognizing truth have already been shaped by representation? And I think that's a fair question because when I say slow down, gather yourself, return to what is true, I'm not suggesting that somewhere underneath everything that has happened to you, there is an untouched original version of yourself that you need to recover. You can't go back to the origin. And I don't think that's the point. The origin gives us a reference point. There was a person who entered into relationship with life, and then life happened. You encountered people, environments, images, ideas, rules, expectations, standards, relationships, loss, love, pain, pleasure, success, failure, things you choose and things you didn't. And through all of those encounters, something was continually happening. You were being changed. Your body changed. Your mind changed. Your relationships changed. Your understanding changed. Your perception changed. Your sense of self changed. Some of those changes happened naturally. Some were cultivated intentionally. And some occurred through conditioning and repetition before you had any awareness that something was being established. So I'm not interested in trying to return to the origin as though none of that happened. It happened, and we cannot change what has already happened. But we can begin to see what became established through those experiences. What did I learn? What became significant? What did I begin believing? What standards did I inherit? Where did attention learn to go? What did I repeatedly practice? What relationships did I establish with myself, with other people, and with life? What eventually became part of what I now call me? Because the person standing here today is not the origin. The present person contains a history of participation. And this is where the present becomes so important. The present gives us somewhere to meet what has already happened, not somewhere to undo it, somewhere to meet it, and maybe see it more clearly. So when I use the word return, I don't mean return backwards. I mean return here. Return attention to what is actually present. Return to the body that is here, the breath that is occurring here, the thought that is appearing here, the emotion that is moving here, the belief that has become active here, the pattern that is repeating here, the person who exists here. Because this is the only place from which I can participate. And maybe I begin noticing this belief didn't originate with me. This standard was given to me. This way of seeing myself developed through a relationship. This response protected me at another point in my life. This image taught me what I was supposed to value. This experience changed what I expected from other people. This pattern has been repeated for so long that I stopped recognizing it as a pattern. I simply called it me. Seeing that doesn't return me to who I was before it happened, but it can change the relationship I have with it now. And that distinction matters to me. And now true. True doesn't mean I finally discovered some objective, uncontaminated version of reality. It doesn't mean this is the real me or the true version of me. For me, returning to what is true means becoming sufficiently present to ask, what is actually happening here? Before I automatically follow what I've been conditioned to make it mean. What is happening in my body? Where did my attention go? What became significant? What thought appeared? What am I assuming? What am I remembering? What am I anticipating? What am I protecting? What am I reaching toward? And from what state am I seeing all of this happen? Because what is happening and what it eventually becomes are not necessarily the same thing. Something happens, attention moves, a memory becomes active, an association forms, meaning is assigned, a familiar narrative appears, and eventually I may be experiencing something much larger than the event that initiated the movement. That experience is still happening. The suffering can be real. The physiological response is real. The thought is occurring. The emotion is occurring. But I can begin asking, am I meeting the actuality of this moment, Or am I meeting what this moment has already become through an established pattern? What happened and what it became through me aren't necessarily the same thing. This is where reflection becomes important. And there's another part of this that I think matters. We can't stop ourselves from changing. Life is movement. Even if I did absolutely nothing intentionally, I would still change. The body changes, relationships change, environments change, experience accumulates, memory accumulates. What we repeatedly encounter affects us. What we repeatedly attend to affects us. What we repeatedly make significant affects us. So, conscious participation isn't an attempt to preserve some original self. It's recognizing that change is already happening and asking whether I can begin participating more consciously in what is being cultivated through that change. Because conditioning itself tells us something important. We are conditionable. Patterns can become established. Ways of seeing can become established. Relationships with ourselves can become established. Standards can become established. And if something can become established through repetition, then our relationship with what has been established can also change through conscious participation. I am not saying that this is easy, not at all. Some patterns were established under extremely difficult conditions. Some helped us survive. Some are deeply embodied. Some are connected to relationships, environments, identities, and experiences that can't simply be thought away. This isn't about telling yourself a different story and pretending the old one never existed. It's about becoming increasingly capable of seeing what is here without immediately being carried away by everything that has learned to capture your attention. And from there, perhaps something can begin to be reestablished. Maybe I can begin consciously examining and, where necessary, reestablishing my own standards. Not because I can somehow become free from every influence I've ever encountered, but because I can begin asking, what matters to me? What do I care for? What am I willing to participate in? What am I no longer willing to participate in? When is my yes actually yes? When is my no actually no? What am I giving significance to? Where am I allowing my attention to gather? What am I practicing through repetition? This is orientation. And when orientation becomes clearer, I don't need every image, opinion, expectation, advertisement, relationship, or external standard to tell me where to stand. I can encounter something without automatically becoming oriented by it. I can consider another possibility without losing myself to it. I can allow something to enter awareness and then discern my relationship with it. And maybe this is how we begin restoring something that can become very difficult to access after years of being oriented externally. Purpose, care, and trust in ourselves. Not confidence that we're always right, not certainty, not control over everything that happens, but trust that we can meet what happens, that we can slow down, that we can gather our attention, that we can look, that we can discern, and that we can consciously participate in what we give significance to. So maybe this is where I would answer Baudrillard. If he asks, how do you know what is true when even your categories for recognizing truth have already been shaped by representation? I don't think the answer is to find something completely untouched by representation. The person I am now has already been shaped. The instrument through which I encounter life has a history. The origin gives me a reference point, but the present gives me a place from which to participate. I can begin recognizing the images, standards, beliefs, and relationships that have participated in shaping how I see. Not so I can change myself back. I can't. But I can change the relationship through which I continue becoming. The origin reminds me that something entered the movement. The present shows me what that movement has become. And conscious participation gives me somewhere to begin from here. This is what I mean when I say return to what is true. And this matters because whether or not I consciously participate in what I give significance to, something is going to become significant. There are images, messages, environments, relationships, and entire systems around us that are already participating in that process. And some are explicitly designed to. Advertising makes this particularly easy to see. If something can orient us toward a perceived problem, attention begins gathering there. If attention remains there, the problem acquires significance. And once it becomes significant, our relationship with ourselves will begin to change. Which brings us to something very ordinary: buying things. Because before the product comes the belief. Advertising makes this particularly visible. Someone wants you to buy something, but usually they can't simply place an object in front of you and expect you to purchase it. They need to give you a reason, and that reason is usually connected to something you already value or something they can teach you to value. Maybe first, I have to make you notice something about yourself. Then, I have to tell you what that thing means. Then, I have to make that meaning significant. Maybe I show you other people who don't appear to have the problem. Maybe I show you an image of who you could become. And then I offer you the solution. By the time the product arrives, an entire field of meaning may already have been established. So, yes, you choose whether to buy it. But I'm interested in something that happens before the choice. What made this meaningful to you? What made this desirable? What made this threatening? What made you believe something needed to be fixed or changed? Where had your attention already been taught to go? The product arrives at the end of the process. Before the purchase, something had to become meaningful. And often, before it became meaningful, attention had to be taught where to look. And the products aren't the only things that can be represented this way. Even authenticity can acquire an image. We've developed signs for what authenticity looks like: unpolished, unscripted, vulnerable, no makeup, messy, raw. But once authenticity has recognizable signs, those signs can also be performed. An unscripted video isn't automatically more authentic than something carefully written. A written piece isn't automatically less true because someone took time to shape the language. The question for me is deeper. From what state am I expressing? What is orienting this expression? What relationship am I establishing with the person receiving it? What am I participating in? Authenticity isn't simply an aesthetic. And this is why I don't find it particularly useful in my own life to imagine that my personal self and professional self are completely separate people. There are appropriate boundaries. There are things that are private. There are different roles and different relationships. But I bring the same history of participation with me wherever I go. My orientation doesn't stay home when I go to work. My patterns don't clock out. The ways attention has been conditioned to move come with me. The body through which I experience life comes with me. Wherever you go, there you are. And when the representation I maintain in one part of my life requires me to continually contradict the way I'm actually living elsewhere, maintaining that division has a cost. Eventually, the image can begin governing the person who created it. And maybe this is another place where Baudrillard's work gives us something worth considering. When does the representation stop representing the life and begin telling the life what it has to become? I don't think the answer is to eliminate images or language or identity or emotion or thought or culture. We couldn't. And I'm not interested in replacing one representation with another and calling the new one the real me. I'm interested in the possibility of seeing clearly. Can I become sufficiently gathered that another possibility becomes visible? Can I encounter a belief without immediately needing to defend it? Can I hear another perspective without losing my orientation? Can I recognize that something I've called me may actually be something I've practiced, inherited, repeated, or needed at another point in my life? And can I discover that without immediately needing to manufacture another identity to replace it? I don't think clear seeing means possessing the truth. I think it means becoming increasingly capable of recognizing what is participating in the way I am seeing. And maybe that is one of the great challenges of being human now. We are surrounded by representations, images asking for our attention, people telling us what something means, products telling us what we need, algorithms continually learning what keeps us looking, identities available for us to inhabit, stories about who we should become. Maybe we can't meet life without mediation, but we can become more aware of what is mediating the encounter. And somewhere inside all of that is a very ordinary practice. Notice, slow down, gather your attention, feel where you are, see what is actually happening. Not so that you can escape the world, so that you can consciously participate in the life you're already living. Slow down, gather yourself, return to what is true. Thank you for being here and spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next reflection.